In the autumn of 1883, the town of Dunbar Crossing in the eastern Wyoming Territory had exactly one property no one wanted. It stood at the far end of Sallow Street, past the feed merchant and the shuttered millinery, set back from the road behind a pair of dead cottonwoods whose bark had gone pale as old bone. The house was 2 stories, once painted the color of cream, now the color of nothing in particular. The front porch had buckled at one end so that it tilted toward the frozen mud like a man leaning into a steady wind. The window glass on the ground floor was intact, which struck most passers-by as odd, given that every other house on that block had lost at least one pane to storms or idle boys over the years. The glass simply stared, dark and flat, offering nothing back to the light, and the front door was nailed shut, not locked, not swollen in its frame the way old wood swells in a wet season. Nailed. From the inside, 3 square-headed iron nails driven through the door into the jamb on a steep diagonal angle, the kind of angle that takes intention and a steady hand, and some knowledge of how wood holds a fastener under stress. No one could explain it because no one had been inside for 11 years. The county put it up at auction on a Tuesday in October. Minimum bid set at $31, which even the county assessor seemed quietly embarrassed to say aloud. $31 for a house and a quarter-acre lot, and a mystery that had lasted over a decade. A woman named Nell Voss paid $32. She was 28 years old and had come to Dunbar Crossing 3 weeks earlier with a canvas traveling bag, a rolled blanket, and a flat wooden case about the size of a bread box, which she kept close and never set down, carelessly. She had taken a room above the druggist's shop on Main Street and paid for it 2 weeks in advance with money she could not readily afford to spend. She had spent 11 days walking the exterior of the house on Sallow Street, noting the foundation, the roof line, the condition of the siding, the way the porch boards had failed before she decided. The auctioneer, a wide man named Fitch who wore his hat low against the October wind, read the Sallow Street address with the same flat voice he used for calling livestock. A small crowd had gathered less because anyone intended to bid than because the thing was worth watching. Nell raised her hand at $32, and the crowd went quiet. In the particular way crowds go quiet, when they are deciding between laughter and something else they cannot name. A man in a canvas coat said something to the man beside him, and both of them glanced in her direction. Fitch read her name into his ledger, took her money, and handed her a receipt. He remarked with no particular malice that she now owned something she might not be able to get into. Nell folded the receipt into the inner pocket of her red shawl and said nothing. She had learned the habit of not answering from her father, a carpenter and cabinet maker named August Voss, who had died of a chest illness in the spring of 1878 when Nell was 22, and already more skilled with a chisel than most men who had been using one for 20 years. August had a rule about answering people who doubted your ability to do a thing. The answer was the finished object, he said, not the argument beforehand. He had told her this at a workbench in the shed behind their house in Laramie when she was 9 years old, and she had never once forgotten it. She was thinking about him when she walked the perimeter of the house that afternoon with her notebook. The quarter-acre lot was thick with dried thistle and the remnants of a kitchen garden that had gone spectacularly to ruin some years earlier. The raised beds collapsed to earth, the wire fencing pressed flat under seasons of accumulated snow. A root cellar door at the back of the house was padlocked with a lock so rusted she could see at a glance that the mechanism had seized entirely. She did not try it. She went around to the side of the house instead and stood looking at the foundation stones. They were good stones, limestone fitted with care, mortared with a fine hand. Whoever had built this house had known what they were doing from the ground up, which told her something about the interior she had not yet seen. The side window on the ground floor was intact like the others, but when Nell pressed her fingertips to the frame, she felt it give slightly at the bottom left corner. Wood that had dried and pulled away from its glazing compound over many seasons. She noted it in her book and moved on. She was not going in tonight, and she was not going in through a window if she could avoid it. She wanted to understand the shape of the thing before she began. If you have ever stood outside something sealed and felt certain there was a reason for its sealing, then you understand what Nell felt on that October afternoon. Not dread, not the unease of a person who fears the dark. More like the focused attention you bring to a locked drawer when you already have the key in your pocket and you are deciding how to open it without breaking anything. She was going to open this house. The only question was how and what she would need once she was inside. She spent 3 evenings at the county recorder's office, which kept its files in a system that could charitably be called hopeful. The clerk, a man named Dunham who was somewhere past 60 and had held the position since before the territory organized its records, found her presence mildly off-putting at first and mildly impressive by the 3rd visit. By the end of that week, he left her alone with the property files without standing over her shoulder, which she took as a quiet professional courtesy, even if he had not intended it that way. The file on the Sallow Street house told her the following story. The house had been built in 1869 by a man named Silas Crane, a claim agent who had arrived in Dunbar Crossing with the land office and remained after the office was reorganized. Crane had sold the house in 1870 to a family named Parrish, a husband and wife with 2 children, for $240. The Parrish family had occupied it for 2 years. In the spring of 1872, a woman named Ruth Parrish had filed a complaint with the county recorder alleging that her husband, Martin Parrish, had transferred 40 acres of their homestead claim to Silas Crane under a separate deed that she had not signed and had not known anything about. The complaint carried a notation in the recorder's cramped hand, indicating it had been referred to the land office. No disposition was recorded. Martin Parrish had left Dunbar Crossing in June of 1872. His wife, Ruth, had remained in the house on Sallow Street through the winter of that year. In February of 1873, the file carried a final notation of 2 words, property abandoned. Then a blank where a forwarding address should have been. Then nothing for 11 years, until the county had taken the property for unpaid taxes and set it before an auctioneer on a cold Tuesday morning. Nell sat with the file for a long time after she had read every page twice. She had a small notebook in which she kept figures and measurements and the occasional word that mattered. She wrote Ruth Parrish into it, and Silas Crane, and 40 acres, and the year 1872. Then she closed the notebook, thanked Dunham, and walked back to her room. Her flat wooden case was on the table under the window where she had left it. She unlatched it and lifted the lid. Inside, in cutouts shaped precisely to each tool, were the instruments her father had left her. 3 chisels of graduated width, a small mallet of dense fruitwood, a set of files, a pair of fine pliers, a brass-tipped probe no longer than her hand. At the center of the case, fitted into its own shaped hollow, a folding brace and bit with 6 interchangeable bits in sizes from 1/4 inch to 3/4. August Voss had built the case himself and lined each cutout with oiled cloth so the tools would not rattle against one another. She checked each one the way he had taught her, looking for rust, checking edges, wiping the bits clean. Then she closed the case and sat with her notebook and thought about nails. 3 square-headed iron nails, driven from the inside, through the door into the jamb on a steep diagonal angle. This was what she kept returning to. You could not drive a nail at that angle in a hurry. You could not drive it in the dark or in a panic. You drove a nail at that angle deliberately, knowing the geometry of how it would hold, wanting it to hold for a long time, and expecting not to be the person who opened it from the other side. You drove those nails if you were a person who understood how things are fastened and how they hold. You drove them if you wanted the house to stay exactly as you had left it. Ruth Parrish had nailed that door shut before she climbed out a window and walked away from Dunbar Crossing in February 1873. Nell was as certain of this as she was of anything she had not yet proven on paper. She began on a Friday morning with her tools and the knowledge of what she was looking for, even if she could not yet say precisely what form it would take. The side window with the failing frame came out cleanly once she worked the glazing with her smallest chisel, loosening the dried compound in sections without cracking the glass. She set the pane against the outside wall of the house, wrapped in her extra blanket, and left it there. She didn't break it. Her father had always held that the measure of a careful worker was what remained undamaged when the work was done. She climbed through the window frame and stood in the kitchen. The air inside was cold and very still, the particular stillness of a room that is not breathed in years. The light came in gray and thin through the intact windows, falling across a kitchen table still set with 2 tin plates and 2 cups, a salt cellar at the center, a dish towel folded neatly over the back of one chair. The cast-iron stove in the corner held a small assembly of ash in its firebox that had never been disturbed. On the shelf above the stove, 4 glass jars of preserved peaches stood in a row, their lids intact, their contents darkened to the color of old amber. Nell stood in the doorway to the hall and did not move for some time. The house smelled of dry wood and cold, and something else she could not name, something faint and mineral. The smell of a place that has been sealed and has kept its own counsel. She had expected disorder. She had expected the signs of a hasty departure, furniture overturned or displaced, objects taken down and left. What she found instead was a table set for a meal that was never served. A room arranged with deliberate and unhurried care. A woman who had taken the time, in February cold, to fold the dish towel before she left. In the years that followed, whenever Nell told this story, she always came back to the dish towel. She did not touch anything on that first day except to observe. She walked through the house slowly with her notebook and a stub of pencil, moving room to room, recording what was present and in what condition. The parlor held a settee covered in dark green wool, dusty but structurally sound. A writing desk stood against the wall, its drop front closed. A small bookcase held 6 volumes. A framed photograph sat on the mantel, the glass cracked at one corner. Upstairs she found 2 bedrooms, both with beds made and blankets folded with the same care she had seen in the kitchen below. In the smaller bedroom, a child's wooden horse lay on the floor on its side. She did not touch the horse. She came back to the writing desk in the parlor, where her attention settled and held. The drop front was fitted with a small brass lock, a simple interior lock of the kind used in furniture from the middle of the century. A warded mechanism with a keyhole no wider than her smallest fingertip. No key was anywhere in sight. She took her brass-tip probe and her narrowest file from the case and knelt in front of the desk in the gray afternoon light. August Voss had taught her furniture locks on a rainy afternoon when she was 14. He had brought home a damaged secretary desk from an estate sale and set it on sawhorses in the shed. He showed her the internal arrangement of the lock through the keyhole by candlelight and mirror, explained the wards, and then let her work the probe until the bolt moved on its own. It had taken her 4 hours that first afternoon. She had not been 14 for 14 years. The bolt moved in 11 minutes. The drop front opened on its brass supports to reveal a writing surface of faded green leather. and above it a series of pigeonholes and small horizontal drawers. She looked at the pigeonholes first. 2 held letters, folded and sealed, the wax long dried to a texture like old clay. She did not break the seals. She turned to the small drawers, 4 of them, each about 2 inches deep and 8 inches wide. The first 3 held what you would expect in a working desk: pen nibs gone to rust, a dried ink bottle tipped on its side, a paper knife, a folded blotter. The 4th drawer, the lowest, was empty except for a folded piece of paper pressed flat against the wood. She unfolded it with the care she would give a piece of old veneer, knowing that etched paper folds will fail if you move them too quickly. It was a property deed. Not the deed to the house on Sallow Street, a deed to 40 acres of homestead land in Cane Creek Canyon, dated March 1872, conveying ownership from Martin Parrish and Ruth Parrish, jointly, to Silas Crane. The deed showed 2 signatures on the line where the sellers' names were written. The signature for Martin Parrish was in one hand. The signature where Ruth Parrish's name appeared was written in the same hand as Martin Parrish's. One hand had written both names. Nell sat back on her heels and looked at the deed in the gray light filtering through the parlor window. She thought about Ruth Parrish setting a dish towel over the back of a kitchen chair. She thought about Ruth Parrish taking the time to place this paper flat in the lowest drawer of a locked desk in a house she was about to seal from the inside and leave. She thought about the precise angle of 3 iron nails driven through a door jamb. She thought about a woman who understood how things are fastened and how they hold, and what it means to leave something for later. Ruth Parrish had not nailed the door shut to hide anything or to keep anyone out. She had nailed it shut to preserve what was inside, to hold the house exactly as she left it, to make the casual entry difficult enough that what she had placed here would survive until someone with the right skills and the right knowledge found it. She had known this deed was evidence of a wrong done to her under color of law. She had not known what to do with it or where to take it, or who in Dunbar Crossing in 1873 would listen to a woman whose husband had already left and whose complaint to the land office had gone without any recorded answer. She had sealed the house and preserved what she had and left it for whoever came next. 11 years later, someone had come. If you have ever held a piece of paper and felt the full weight of what it cost the person who kept it, you will know something of what Nell felt in that parlor. She is still thinking about it, in her way, even now. She spent the rest of that afternoon reading what was in the pigeonholes. She did not open the sealed letters, which felt like the right decision, and which she maintained even when it was difficult. The 4 unsealed letters folded in the right pigeonhole were written in a small, clear, very steady hand that she took to be Ruth Parrish's own. They were not addressed to anyone. They were a private record, a careful and methodical account written by a woman who had no legal mechanism to compel anyone to hear her, but who understood precisely what had been done to her and why, and by whom. The 40 acres in Cane Creek Canyon had been homestead land filed by Martin Parrish in 1870. Under Wyoming territorial law as passed in 1869, a wife held a recognized homestead interest in land filed jointly, one of the few such legal protections anywhere in the country at that time. Ruth Parrish had known this. She had written out the relevant statute language in the second letter with a clarity and precision that told Nell she had composed this passage more than once, that she had held this knowledge in her mind for a long time before she committed it to paper and stored it in a locked desk against the day it might be needed. Silas Crane had purchased the 40 acres in Cane Creek Canyon, using a deed on which Ruth Parrish's name appeared in her husband's handwriting. He had then sold those 40 acres in 1873 to a ranching syndicate for $900. Ruth Parrish had received nothing. Her husband had gone. The land office had referred her complaint to itself and produced no answer on record. Silas Crane had left Dunbar Crossing a more prosperous man than he had arrived. Nell spent 7 days in the house before she told anyone what she had found. She needed to understand the full shape of the evidence before she did anything with it, and she had learned from her father that acting before you understand the shape of a thing was the surest way to damage it. So she went slowly. She went through every drawer in the house, every pigeonhole, every book on the shelf opened and fanned for anything tucked between its pages, every corner and shelf and built-in ledge that the house offered for examination. She went through the kitchen carefully, checking the canister shelf and the space behind the cast-iron stove and the underside of the kitchen table, where a person might have fixed something they wanted to keep close. She went through the upstairs rooms with equal patience, checking beneath the mattress ticking, and inside the pillow slips and the folded blankets. She found 2 more deeds tucked into the lining of a sewing basket beneath the bed in the larger bedroom. Not stitched in, not glued, but folded small and pressed flat between the quilted lining and the wicker body of the basket, invisible unless you ran your fingers around the interior seam and felt the stiffness where paper lay beneath cloth. The deeds described smaller parcels than Cane Creek Canyon, a lot in town and a parcel of timber ground south of the creek, involving the same parties, bearing the same pattern on a smaller scale and at earlier dates. They told a story of accumulation. Silas Crane had not moved once against the parish homestead. He had moved 3 times, methodically, each time using the machinery of paperwork and the absence of any authority, with the patience to investigate it. She looked at those 2 deeds for a long time in the upstairs light. Then she added them to her notebook with the same careful labeling she had given the others, and set them flat on the parlor writing desk with the rest. She also found, tucked inside the front cover of a Bible on the bookcase shelf, a small photograph. A woman in a dark dress with a firm set to her jaw, standing beside 2 children who held themselves very straight and looked directly into the camera with the serious faces children wear when they are told to hold still. On the back of the photograph, in the same small, clear hand she had come to know well from the letters, someone had written 3 words and 2 dates. Ruth, Clara and James, Cane Creek Canyon, June 1871. The clerk, Dunham, did not look up from his ledger when Nell came in on the Thursday of the 2nd week. He was accustomed to her presence by then, and had arrived at a kind of quiet tolerance for it. She set the deed and the 4 letters and the 2 additional deeds on the counter in front of him, each document laid flat and labeled in her notebook with a description and the location where she had found it. She placed Ruth Parrish's photograph beside them. She waited. Dunham read through the deed. He went still partway through it in the way a careful reader goes still when the document he is reading says something he had not expected. He read the first letter. He looked at the photograph for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read across the counter of a county office on a November afternoon, and then he set it down very carefully and called for the territorial land agent, who came to Dunbar Crossing only on the first Friday of each month, to be asked whether he might come sooner. The land agent's name was Harlow, a spare and methodical man with the careful manner of someone who had spent a long career making distinctions between what the record showed and what could be proven. He came the following Wednesday. He read every document Nell had brought from the house, one after another, in the same patient way Nell had read them in the gray light of the parlor. He compared the signatures on the forged deed with 3 examples of Martin Parrish's handwriting that he located in the territorial records through a search that took most of that afternoon. He took the original deed and the letters and the 2 supplemental deeds into official custody and wrote out a receipt for Nell with both hands extended when he gave it to her. which she took as a particular kind of acknowledgment that cost him nothing but carried some weight. Silas Crane had died in 1879, which meant that any question of the $900 he had received for the Cane Creek Canyon land would need to travel through the procedures of his estate. The ranching syndicate he had sold to had dissolved in 1881. These were not simple paths, and Harlow told her so plainly and without apology. She respected the plainness. She had not come expecting simple paths. What was not complicated, or not as complicated as it might have been, was this. Ruth Parrish had a daughter, Clara, who appeared in the county record of Cheyenne as Clara Parrish Holt, married in 1882, which placed her at approximately 12 or 13 years old at the time of the photograph Nell had found in the Bible. This was consistent. Clara's brother James did not appear in any county record that Harlow could locate, which told its own quiet story about what the years between 1872 and the present had held. Harlow found Clara within 10 days of taking the deed into custody. She was living in Cheyenne, 24 years old, employed as a seamstress in a shop on Capitol Avenue. The letter Harlow wrote to her about the discovery of the deed and her mother's letters took nearly a month to produce an answer. When the answer came, it was short, written in a hand that Nell, when Harlow read it aloud to her, recognized before she could explain why. Then she understood. Clara had her mother's handwriting, the same small, clear, deliberate hand. The letter said that she had known her mother kept something in the house, that she had been 12 when they left and had watched her mother fold the dish towel and place it over the chair and nail the front door, that she had not known anyone would ever go in. The proceedings related to Silas Crane's estate were slow and did not deliver what the full wrong would have required in the way of justice. The land could not be returned because it had passed through 2 more sets of hands since 1873, and now belonged to people who had paid honest prices for it and done nothing wrong by any measure. What Harlow pressed for, with the patience of a man who believed the official record mattered regardless of what the practical outcome could achieve, was a formal notation in the Territorial Land Office acknowledging the fraudulent conveyance, naming the forged signature by the name of the man who had written it, and stating plainly that Ruth Parrish's homestead interest had never been lawfully extinguished. The notation took 4 months to obtain. There were letters exchanged with the territorial capital, and a review by a land commissioner who came through on circuit in February and sat with the documents for 3 hours in the recorder's back room. Nell was not present for that review. Harlow told her about it afterward in the same spare way he told her most things. The commissioner had noted that the forgery was clear from the documents, had noted also that Silas Crane was 11 years dead and the original land transferred twice over, and had agreed that the record should be corrected even where no other remedy existed. He had put his signature to the notation and moved on. It was, in the end, a correction written into a ledger. It was not $900 and it was not 40 acres. It was the truth, placed on the official record in the place it had always belonged, which was the only place Ruth Parrish had ever tried to put it. Clara Parrish Holt came to Dunbar Crossing in the spring of 1884. She arrived alone on the Tuesday stage and walked to Sallow Street without asking anyone for directions, which told Nell something about what the house had meant to her and how long she'd been carrying its address in her memory. Nell was working on the front porch, replacing the buckled boards with new lumber she had sourced from the mill east of town, when Clara arrived at the end of the front walk and stopped. The cottonwood trees along the walk were putting out their first pale leaves of the season. Clara stood looking at the house for a long time, and Nell did not rush her, setting her hammer down quietly on the board beside her knee and giving the moment its weight. Clara said at last that her mother had kept everything exactly as she left it. Nell said that she had. Clara said that her mother had always spoken of the house as waiting, and that she had assumed this was a grief her mother carried, the wish to go back. She said she had not known, until Harlow's letter arrived, what her mother had actually meant. Nell did not say anything more. The house had been waiting. Ruth Parrish had understood something that Nell had come to understand from the other direction, working toward it with her probe and her chisel, instead of away from it with a hammer and nails. A truth sealed into a place does not expire with the person who placed it there. It waits. It waits for someone with the right knowledge to open the thing that contains it, the way iron waits in ore, the way timber waits in a standing tree, patient without effort, present without announcement. Clara went inside alone and stayed a little over an hour. When she came out, she carried 3 things: the photograph of herself and her brother and her mother at Cane Creek Canyon, the Bible from the bookcase, the folded dish towel from the back of the kitchen chair. She had left everything else exactly as it was. She thanked Nell on the front walk and shook her hand in both of hers. Nell walked her to the stage office and watched the Tuesday coach turn north toward Cheyenne. The house on Sallow Street did not stay empty after that. Nell spent the summer of 1884 making it habitable, using the skills her father had given her and the time she had in front of her and the particular authority that comes from owning a place and understanding its construction from its stones up. She replaced the porch boards and repainted the exterior in the original cream color, matching it to the paint she found dried in a tin in the root cellar after she cut the rusted padlock free with a cold chisel. She reglazed the kitchen window using the same glass she had removed carefully in October, which had spent the winter leaned against the side of the house under a blanket and had not cracked. She oiled the floors and the furniture and tended the writing desk with beeswax and a soft cloth until the wood came back to something near its original warmth. And she addressed the nails, the 3 iron nails her father would have studied and then respected. She pulled them clean from the jamb with a finish bar and a shim of cedar so as not to damage the wood around them. She examined the holes they had left, which were tight and straight, and told her everything she had already concluded about the hand that had driven them. She filled the holes with a wooden plug compound and let it set for 2 days before she planed it flush and finished the surface. Then she fitted the front door with a proper lock of her own making, a pin tumbler mechanism her father had designed and sketched in the notebook he had kept at his workbench, a design she had built from his drawings after he died, because it seemed the right use of what he had left her. It was a good lock. The bolt moved without friction in its housing, and the key turned with the kind of smooth, complete action that tells a person familiar with mechanisms that every component has been fitted with care. She installed it on a Friday afternoon in July, with the summer light slanting warm and long across the porch boards she had laid herself, and she worked the key a dozen times before she was satisfied. Then she went inside and locked the door from within, the way Ruth Parrish had done 11 years before, with nails and a hammer, and the knowledge of how things hold. She stood for a moment in the hall, listening to the house, the way it settled in the summer heat, the small sounds of old wood expanding in the afternoon warmth. The light came through the parlor window and lay across the floor in a long, pale rectangle, and moved as the afternoon moved. She opened the door again with her key and went out to put her tools away. The auctioneer Fitch walked past the house on a Saturday morning in August when Nell was trimming the dead branches from one of the cottonwood trees along the front walk. He slowed his pace and looked at the house for a moment, taking in the painted siding, the repaired porch, the clean windows, the tree she was working on. He did not say anything, which she took as the only acknowledgement available from a man who had handed a woman a deed to a nailed-shut house and made a remark about it. She kept trimming. She moved into the house on the 1st of September 1884, a year almost exactly from the day she had first stood outside it on that October afternoon and felt the shape of the thing sealed inside. She brought her canvas traveling bag and her blanket and her father's tool case, which she set on the shelf above the writing desk in the parlor where she could see it from her chair when she sat at the drop front in the evenings, working by lamplight. She found over the following weeks that the house had a quality she had not expected and could not fully name. It was not warmth exactly, because the climate of a Wyoming autumn does not lend warmth freely, and the cast iron stove in the kitchen required competent tending. It was more like an attentiveness, the feeling of a place that had been carefully maintained against the moment of its opening, and that had kept its word. The floors were sound beneath her repairs. The walls held heat once she filled the gaps in the plaster that had worked loose over 11 winters. The writing desk opened and closed on its brass supports without complaint, its lock turning now in a mechanism she understood from every component inward. She hung the framed photograph back on the mantel. She had replaced the cracked corner glass in a new frame, keeping the image centered the way she had found it. The photograph showed a group of people she did not know, gathered somewhere she could not identify. A picnic, or a Sunday gathering, or simply an afternoon that someone had thought worth preserving. She did not know whether it had belonged to the Parishes or had already been there when they arrived. It had stayed on the mantel through 11 winters, and she left it where it was. The county clerk, Dunham, sent a man to her in October of that year with a broken secretary cabinet, a large piece with a failing timbre, and a lock that had been forced and damaged. Nell looked at it for 10 minutes and gave him a price and a date. He came back on the date she named and found the piece repaired, the timbre running clean in its tracks, the lock replaced with a mechanism she had fitted herself. He paid her price without negotiating, which in her experience meant she had priced it correctly. He came back in January with 2 more pieces. By the following spring, she had enough work to keep her through the year without difficulty. The house on Sallow Street holds on the county record now under a different name, the name of its current owner, which is hers. In her own notebook, the one she kept from the beginning, she never changed the notation she had made in the first days after she opened the house. Below the address and the lot number, she had written 2 initials and a date, and a small line that she intended as a record of the interior world she had inherited. R. Parish, 1872. Preserved here. The county record does not know about that line. Some things belong to the house and not to the record. There is a question, if you have watched this story with me to its end, that I think you may already be carrying. Not about Silas Crane, who is past all accounting, or about the land office, which corrected its record and moved on to other matters. The question is about a woman standing in a cold house in February of 1873, with a hammer and 3 nails, folding a dish towel over a chair before she went out a window into the snow. What she knew that no one around her could be made to hear. What she built out of that knowledge, not a grievance, but a preservation, a sealed and tended record left for someone else to open in another time. If that kind of steadiness is something you recognize, if you have ever held a truth no one would take from your hands and found a way to keep it anyway, I think you know something of what Ruth Parrish carried across 11 years of a house she never went back to. Nell Voss kept her father's folding brace and bit in its shaped hollow in the case on the shelf above the writing desk. The brass fittings had gone a little green with the years, the way brass does when it is handled, and then rested, and then handled again. She polished them on Sunday evenings with a soft cloth and set the case back on the shelf in the exact position where she could see it from her chair. It was the kind of tending her father had given his tools, treating them as though the care and the use were not separate activities conducted at different times, but the same labor conducted at different speeds. She had taken this from him without knowing she had taken it. The way you take the things that matter from the people who teach you. In the moments when you are paying attention to something else entirely. The front door of the house on Sallow Street opens now on the lock she made from her father's design, the bolt moving clean and true in a housing fitted without a fraction of slack. She locks it when she leaves and unlocks it when she comes home, and neither action takes more than a moment, which is what a good lock feels like when it has been built by someone who understood what it was for. She knew what Ruth Parrish had known, though she had arrived at the knowledge from the other side of the wood. A door that closes well is not a door that keeps the world out. It is a door that opens cleanly for the people who carry the right key at the right time, after the long patience of a sealed and waiting house has done its work. She put the key in her coat pocket and walked in from the autumn light, and the door settled behind her in its frame without a sound.